Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar in our series of annual conference webinars taking place this week and next. I'm Nick Forbes, leader of the LGA Labour Group, also leader of Newcastle City Council. And like many of you, I'm disappointed not to be in Harrogate today for the LGA's annual conference. In fact, I'm missing it so much that I ordered my own box of Betty's goodies online to feel part of the occasion. So please do, if you want to support the local economy in Harrogate today, look online and see what fantastic goods they've got. Of course, other baked goods are also available. Now, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and we're running it as a Zoom webinar, which means that we've got lots of participants, but if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. And what we'll do when we get to the question session later on is if I am able to pick you to ask a question, we'll promote you to be a panelist and you can address the meeting as a panelist. We'll then give our guests the opportunity to answer the questions. And I want to thank our sponsors, CCLA, for their support in helping us put on this series of webinars. Now, today we have a really important guest to speak to us. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Sir Keir Starmer to our virtual world and our virtual conference today. Keir was elected leader of the Labour Party earlier this year. Before that, he'd served in the shadow cabinet as Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU, and also as a shadow immigration minister. And Keir rang me on the day that he was elected Labour leader to say that he wanted to work with me and other Labour leaders around the country to make sure that we had a good, strong working relationship. And I'm very grateful that Keir has followed through on that promise, more of which I'm sure we'll get into this afternoon. And I think in many ways, Keir shows just what our economy needs: strong growth, impressive stability, solid roots. And of course, that's just his hair. And in fact, he and I were just joking in our National Executive Committee yesterday that one of the most trusting things that you can do with your partner is allow them to cut your hair for you. It's a great pleasure, Keir, to be able to have you here at the LGA's virtual conference. And I'm sure if we were in the hall, we'd all give you a big round of applause. Please accept a virtual round of applause as I hand over to Sir Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition. Okay, that was the rehearsal. Hi, Keir. Sorry, Keir.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I've just teed you up, but I gather you were just nipping back into the office.
So, yeah, sorry about that. We were just finished PMQs and had one or two bits and bobs to do, but we're here now. And well, very glad to be with you.
You missed my joke about your hair, I'm afraid.
I hope it was a good joke. I am going to get my hair cut pretty soon, all things being equal.
Yes, it was. I'll tell you it privately afterwards. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to everybody for inviting me to speak today. It seems a long time since I was with you at last year's LGA conference in Bournemouth. In fact, looking at you across this screen, it feels almost like another world. I had hoped that this would be a chance for us to meet in person, as I know everybody would have done. It would have been my first major conference of my leadership, a chance to thank our fantastic local government leaders, to hear about the challenges you're facing, to discuss our vision for the future of local government, and to underline that under my leadership, local government will be at the heart of how Labour rebuilds our country and our communities. But as with so much in the last few months, we've had to adapt. my first speech as Labour leader, that moment when I thought I would be addressing the nation, was filmed in my living room with just a microphone and a camera. And my first conference now is by Zoom. So welcome to 2020. I want to thank everybody at the LGA, though, for making it possible for us to meet like this today, albeit virtually. I know a huge amount of work has gone into that. And I also want to say really a much wider thanks to all of you, to all of our councillors, all the cabinet members and the leaders, to the officials, the officers and the staff, to the more than 1 million people working in local government, the length and breadth of the country. Even in normal times, you deliver the services that we all depend on, the ones that, frankly, are simply too often taken for granted. But during this crisis, you've been literally at the front line, whether that's in our care homes, delivering social care, obtaining protective equipment, preventing homelessness, emptying our bins, keeping our streets safe, and delivering food and basic supplies to those in need. You've been among the unsung heroes of the crisis. We all now know who the key workers really are. So I just want to start really by saying thanks to all of you. Of course, everything now is seen through the prism of coronavirus. This is the greatest crisis our country has faced in most of our lifetimes. Our economy has been shut down, leaving businesses and workers alike facing huge uncertainty, and you can feel that in our communities. Loved ones went months without seeing one another. And for some, this meant agonizing decisions, missing births, even funerals. And tragically, many of us have friends, family, constituents, and neighbours who were taken too soon by this awful disease. The UK has suffered more than most countries. 65,000 people have died because of COVID-19, one way or the other. Our economy is projected to decline by more than any other OECD country this year. And millions of people are living in insecurity about their jobs and their incomes. But during this crisis, we've also seen incredible and inspiring moments. Captain Tom Moore, who captured the nation's imagination in raising £32 million for NHS charities. The dedication and bravery of those tackling this disease on the front line. And the quiet selflessness of those who came together to form community groups, check in on the elderly and vulnerable neighbours. No one is pretending we're out of this darkness yet, but they have been the glimmers of light that have got us through. And when we come out of this crisis, it will be because of them. We're now, I think, in a new phase of the pandemic. As lockdown restrictions begin to ease, people are returning to work, to the high streets, to the public places in towns and cities across the country. We welcome that. It may seem strange for the leader of the opposition to say this, but we want the government to get this right. People's lives and their livelihoods depend on it. So the onus is now on the government to deliver, to provide the systems, the reassurance, and the clear public messaging that will allow this to happen safely. From the earliest days of my leadership, I've said to the government, they need an exit strategy, a coherent plan to bring the country together. My fear now is that we've got an exit, but without a strategy. The Prime Minister is good at rhetoric. He started this pandemic saying Britain was ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth to emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion. But he can't govern. And his failure to plan, to act quickly and decisively, to take the right decisions at the right time, has held Britain back, whether on protective equipment, care homes, or testing. As a result, those at the front line have too often lacked the power and resources they need. Nowhere is this truer than in local government. After a decade of cuts, the coronavirus crisis and the government's inaction have created a perfect storm. Councils are faced with much higher costs for key services such as social care and much lower revenues through falls in areas such as business rates. As a result, and you know this far better than I do, you've estimated that councils now face a black hole of about £10 billion. And a report last week showed that 8 in 10 councils face cutting services or Section 144 notices and effectively bankruptcy. This isn't party political. Conservative councils and Labour councils face the same problems. And as you know better than anyone, this would have real effects on the services we all rely on. It could mean further cuts to social care, fewer police officers. It could mean streetlights going on later and going off earlier. It could mean libraries, gyms and community centres staying closed. The places that give meaning and character to our communities. I've raised this with the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions over the last 2 weeks, but as you may have seen, I haven't had many answers, or at least not many coherent ones. In fact, I'm not even sure the Prime Minister has understood the scale of the problem local councils are facing, or the immediacy. I'm also not sure he understands how central local authorities will be in the next phase of the crisis and in preventing a second spike. That's why I called last week at PMQs for councils to be given much clearer guidance and new powers to enforce local lockdowns if needed. We've seen this week how important that is. Again, rather than take this seriously and put a plan in place, the Prime Minister ignored it. And then when the MP for Hove, Peter Kyle, warned that seaside towns and councils would be unable to cope with people rushing to our beaches or parks in the summer, the Prime Minister said he should simply show some guts and determination. 2 days later, 500,000 people crowded onto Bournemouth Beach, and the local council had no choice but to declare a major incident. As we begin to emerge from this stage of the crisis, we need much stronger and more focused leadership, and we need to build a new relationship between national and local government. To end the over-centralisation of power and resources in Westminster, to push it much closer to local communities. Part of that is empowering local government, councillors at the front line of this crisis. Councillors are often the first to see where national government is going wrong, yet too often they're ignored. And too often central government is too slow to respond. We need to change that. Under my leadership of the Labour Party, we're already giving local government a much bigger part in Labour politics. We have a brilliant former local government leader in Jim McMahon in the Shadow Cabinet, and Steve Reed as well. Nick Forbes joins my weekly Shadow Cabinet meetings to ensure the voice of local government is in the room whenever decisions are made. And we've ensured that every member of the Shadow Cabinet has been partnered with a local government leader. And while we're out of power for far too long nationally, in towns and cities across the UK, Labour is changing people's lives through our mayors and our councillors. But my commitment to local government doesn't just exist in opposition. A Labour government would win power in order to hand it back to the nations, regions, cities and towns across our country. We would give local government a much bigger say over investment and services. Not through plans devised by someone in an office in Whitehall, but through plans created and rooted in communities, so that they truly serve the people. We would put local government, its power and innovation straight at the heart of Westminster by replacing the House of Lords with a democratic second chamber, representing the nations and regions of the UK. And we would give councillors, communities and people on the front line in our public services a bigger say over the decisions that affect them. Because at the heart of the broken trust in national politics and politicians is a feeling that we aren't listening, that we don't care, that we don't understand. Listen to Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's Questions each week and you can understand why. But working with you, we want to prove this wrong and truly empower local communities. So where services people use in their daily lives are no longer a source of convenience, but frustration, let's make them truly accountable to people they serve. Where politics feels distant or remote, or like something that is done to people rather than with them and for them, let's break down those barriers and make sure people have the power to make their voices heard. and where government in Westminster imposes decisions and cuts that trample on innovation, put businesses out of action, or damage people's lives and livelihoods without fully understanding the consequences, let's offer a vision of a fairer Britain that will be better for everyone. One of the most inspiring parts of my first few months as Labour leader has been the chance to speak to people from across the country in the Cllr sessions that I've been running. Although we've had to do these virtually, they've been the chance to have a frank, honest, and even difficult conversation with people who felt they couldn't vote Labour in December. Speaking to local government leaders across the country has been a similar experience, inspiring, albeit sometimes bruising. I've heard about so many fantastic, innovative ideas and been left bewildered and frankly ashamed of how far behind national government is. In Plymouth, for example, the council has set up dozens of community-owned energy co-ops that generate energy sustainably and plough the profits back into projects. In Preston, we've used the financial muscle of council contracts to ensure investment and jobs go where local people need them most. And in Barking and Dagenham, we've launched a project that opens up empty shops for use by dozens of community groups. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Here's a Labour leader praising Labour councils. What a surprise. But I also know that non-Labour councils are doing inspiring and brilliant work too. And we have much to learn from you as well. Because the reality is that in this instance, it's not about the colour of the council. It's about local government's focus on getting things done. That should be a lesson to us. And I want us to learn those lessons. So thank you for allowing me to be with you today. And let's make this the start of something that makes Britain a better governed place, inspired by the lessons learned on the front line, lessons that come from people, practitioners, and the public. Let's set out a vision for the future that puts them at its heart. I promise for my part that the Labour Party's doors will always be open to you. We will always work in good faith. We will always be a friend and an ally to local government. Thank you.
Thank you, Keir. That's really inspiring to hear. And I'll move straight on to a number of questions. I'm going to take a first round of three. I'm going to take Sean Davis, Richard Watson, Louise Gittins. And just while we're getting those up, voted as panellists to ask questions, can I just gently remind my Labour colleagues in the Q&A session that this is a cross-party LGA event, and of course Keir will be happy to answer questions about internal Labour Party issues, just not in public in this forum, and there will be other opportunities for Labour colleagues to ask internal Labour Party questions in other ways. Sean, are you there yet? Sean Davis.
Thanks, Nick. Firstly, Keir, a massive well done for all the work that you've done as leader of the Labour Party in your first few months. It's been fantastic how you've connected to local government right across the country. My question's on planning, Keir. Local councils know their areas best. Where should planning decisions be taken? In town halls or in Whitehalls or at another fundraising event?
In town halls. I mean, you're absolutely right, Sean. Councils know their communities and they know the planning decisions that need to be made. And so we want more control locally, not less control locally. And obviously this has been the focus of a considerable amount of attention in the last few days. But the idea that the housing crisis is all about a planning problem is completely misconceived in my view. So let's put planning decisions where they belong, which is in local communities made by local councils, but recognise that we can actually deal with the housing crisis, not by changing the planning system, but by actually putting our shoulder to the wheel to build the house that's been promised so many, many times. So thank you, Sean.
Richard.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, Keir, for I think being the first Labour leader in certainly all the time I've been attending LGA conference to come and speak to us. It's really appreciated. I wanted to ask you, Keir, about local government finance. I'm leader of Islington Council and I chair the LGA Resources Board. And clearly, well, local councils have done heroic work through this crisis. There's a major funding deficit, as you referred to in your speech, between the welcome government support we've had so far and actually what we need to get us through this crisis. What's your take on what we should be getting financially to make sure that local communities and public services aren't unwitting victims of the coronavirus crisis?
Thanks, Richard. If you'll forgive me, one of the downsides of doing this virtually is that I'm in Parliament and the division bell is just going. I don't think we've got a vote, but it just means it'll ring for a few more seconds before I can get onto that. Right, back to it. Richard, look, thanks for raising funding. This is in all the meetings I've had with local council leaders in the last 3 or 4 weeks. This has been one of the central concerns. This is, sorry. This should be the last of these for a while.
Can I just say how quaint it is that in Parliament people have to go and actually physically move around and vote? I mean, in local government, we've had electronic voting and absentee voting for quite a period of time now, and we think Parliament can probably learn a thing or two from local government in how to do democracy efficiently. Anyway, sorry, Keir, I interrupted. You were going to give Richard an answer about funding and finance.
Yeah, thanks for covering that, Nick. Good double act. That should be it for now, although I'm probably tempting fate by saying that. Richard, on funding, as I was saying, one of the things that's come up most often in all my discussions with local council leaders in the last few weeks and months has been the question of funding, because there was a very, very clear message given by the Community Secretary to council leaders at the beginning of the pandemic, that they should do whatever is necessary to support their communities, and the government would support them in that. And I know it was a message received by council leaders, because I think it was written in a letter to all council leaders and also said in a speech. So there was a sense that I think council leaders and councillors across the country have had, that they were being asked, understandably, to be on the front line, do what was necessary in relation to the response to coronavirus. Huge amount that needed to be done, you know, whether it's social care, provision of services, dealing with homelessness, you name it. But as the weeks have gone by, the government has begun to go back on that promise. I mean, I know this is a deep cause for concern. True it is that the government has put some money into local government, but it's far short of the £10 billion shortfall. And I think, you know, it's a central cause for concern that most councils, and this is not a party political point, councils with different political leaderships are facing the prospects of cuts or a Section 114. And that's why I've been trying to press the government on this at PMQs, and Steve Reid and his team have been doing it in Parliament as well. And this has just got to be resolved. More money is going to be needed to put into local councils, because there's already that shortfall, that gap. We are now easing the lockdown. That will put a greater strain on local councils in relation to the delivery of services. So this is something where I think the government just needs to get around a table and sort this out with local council leaders.
Thanks, Keir. Louise Gittins.
Thank you, and thank you, Keir, for your warm words and support for local government. I've got a topical question. I think it was raised today in PMQs, and it's about test and trace. So what extra powers and support do you think should be given to local government to ensure that test and trace is fully operational and, importantly, works effectively, including access to things like timely granular Pillar 2 data, ability to carry out local and agile mobile testing, and to manage local outbreaks? So what do you think needs to happen next, and what do you think's gone wrong so far? Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. This did come up today, and I fear it's going to come up over the next few days, because across the country there are different areas that are worried that what's happened in Leicester may be about to happen in their area. Let me take the points you make in order. The provision of data. I asked the Prime Minister about this today. One of the problems in Leicester, as people on this conference call will know, is that the local authority were given Pillar 1 test results, but not Pillar 2 test results. So therefore the local authority and the mayor in Leicester, until last Thursday, were under the impression that the number of positive COVID tests in Leicester was about 80. If they'd had the Pillar 2 test results, they'd have known it was 944. So it's this is not just a technical issue between different levels of tests. It's a massive difference, and that data simply wasn't shared, and it wasn't shared with the council until last Thursday, which was obviously a week after the health secretary said there was a feared outbreak of coronavirus in Leicester. That is a lost week. It's a massive gap. I was surprised that when I raised this with the Prime Minister, he said, no, local authorities have had access to all the data they need. That is not what I've been told by local authorities in the last few days. You will know better than I do, but I think it's not true. We need absolutely sharing of all data, and it's not just all the test results. It's of course some of the details about the postcodes, the areas, some precision about where the highest infection rates may be. So share the data. In terms of the powers that are necessary, two ways of approaching this. The first is get people around a table and agree what can be done by consensus. Most people are quite prepared to do the right thing if there's confidence in the decisions that are being made. But secondly, we're going to have backup powers for local authorities. There are some things local authorities can do under the rules, as you know. There are some things they can't do. And if you need to close down a particular area, at the moment, I don't think local authorities have got the necessary powers to do it. And what we can't have is a situation where statutory instruments or other bits of legislation have to be passed in a hurry in response to each outbreak. So there's a huge amount of work to do there. I just put something else on the table, Louise, that I would genuinely like the views of people at this conference on, which is assuming there are going to be local outbreaks and therefore restrictions as we've seen in Leicester, which I think were handled badly and too slowly without sharing the data. What then is the criteria for lifting the restriction? Because if it's reviewed after 2 weeks, what is it we're reviewing? Are we going to do mass community testing in order to better understand the infection rate in the area that's been locked down or not? I think this is pressing now. It's pressing in Leicester. 4,000 businesses have been shut in Leicester, and I think about 160 schools. So you can feel the impact. If it happens in other areas, this is going to become a major issue for the coming weeks or months, and we need a plan. Personally, I would have liked to have seen a protocol for the sharing of data, guidance for local authorities with a step-by-step guide, who has what power to do what in what order. And actually, it would have made good sense to have had a sort of desktop exercise to work through what might happen in a situation like this. And as far as I know, none of that has happened, and certainly none of the local leaders that I've spoken to have suggested anything like that has happened. So there's a big gap there, Louise. Long answer to your question, but I think this is going to become a very, very pressing issue over the coming weeks.
Thanks, Keir. I'm going to ask another round of questions to join the panel. I'm going to take Jackie Taylor. There's an interesting question from somebody called Ian M.I. I'm not quite sure who that is, but we'll get you up and find out. And Adam Fox. Shall
we do three at a go, Nick, and then I can come back on all three? Probably makes more sense.
I was going to suggest that, Keir, if that's okay with you. And just while we're talking about the getting these people up onto the panel and talking about the test and trace regime, clearly it's absolutely essential that we have it in place to enable the recovery. But as you rightly identify, one of the challenges that we've got is no nationally agreed thresholds for either promoting a local lockdown or bringing someone out of a local lockdown if it has had one imposed. And that's something that a number of us have been raising directly with government for several weeks now.
Yeah, Nick, I think this is a real problem, and it's a foreseeable problem, which is, what is the criteria for going into a local lockdown, and then what's the criteria for coming back out? What's the guidance that is there? But there are also other problems that, and I don't want to be too party political, but the Prime Minister is refusing to see a massive problem, and that is that however good the track and trace and isolate scheme may be in relation to the people that are actually contacted, there are probably 3/4 of the people who have the infection who are not being contacted. So if you take the ONS figures, the latest ones from last week, the estimated number of people in the community with coronavirus just at the moment is 22,000. The number that have been contacted to provide their contact details so that the trace and isolate can work is 5,000. So you've got this mismatch, a large group of people who've got the infection, but only roughly a quarter that are even going into the track, trace and isolate system. This is a massive problem that just has to be confronted and dealt with. And I do appreciate it's complicated, and there are cases where there are no symptoms, so it's difficult. But I think just walking past this problem is going to be a big mistake. And if we don't get to grips with it, we could be in a local lockdown situation for months and months and months. And I think for local councils, this is, I think all of you will dread the idea that your local area is subject to a lockdown, because it'll have profound implications in relation to everything that you do. Nick, sorry about the long answer, but I do feel really strongly that this has got to be gripped. This is going to be the story of the summer if we're not careful.
I completely agree, Keir, and of course it's something that all of us on this session, regardless of political affiliation, are really grappling with, because it's completely new territory for us. Let's take another round of questions. Firstly, Jackie Taylor.
Thank you. I just introduced myself. I'm the Liberal Democrat Cabinet Member for Housing at St Albans District Council.
Hi, Jackie.
My question, the coronavirus pandemic has shown how local councils are, without doubt, best placed to work with rough sleepers and move them into accommodation and support them to take steps to improve their lives. Whilst extra funding for rough sleepers due to the pandemic has been welcome, generally dealing with homelessness and rough sleeping is largely funded by relatively short-term grants, plus some extra from the general fund of council tax. This can lead to short-termism, a lack of career stability for professionals in this field, as well as some financial burden falling on council taxpayers, many of whom are struggling themselves. How would you fund tackling homelessness and rough sleeping differently?
Well, sorry, I'm going to do three. Yeah, okay. Sorry, Nick, fire away.
Ian. I'm intrigued to find out who Ian is. Ian. Maybe on mute.
Yeah, it's Ian Miller here. I work in Wild Forest District Council in Worcestershire. I'm an officer, so officer is not a party political point that I'm making. Is the New Deal enough in its scale? Should much more money be invested by the government to help the economic recovery in all areas and support the levelling up agenda, with full delegation of large sums to councils to allow them to decide what the priorities are locally?
And Adam Fox, please.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Keir, for speaking up so loudly for local government. I'm the Labour and Co-op Cabinet Member at Colchester Borough Council. What can we do to ensure that the future structures of local government meet the needs of our local communities and does not put people in local boroughs, districts and towns even further away from decision makers?
Nick, I'll take those three, probably make sense. Jackie, on rough sleeping, I think everybody's been shocked by the increase in rough sleeping over recent years. And the government did the right thing by ensuring that when we started going through the health aspect of this pandemic, measures were taken to help people off the streets and into accommodation. And frankly, that showed that this was always a political issue that could have been resolved earlier, in my view, because if you've got the political will to do something about it, something could have been done about it before. What we can't do now is hopefully come through the pandemic, which was going to take time, and then just go back to business as usual and somehow allow people to sort of drift back to the streets. And that means providing not just shelter, a roof above our head, but actually all the support that goes around it. And again, all of you, through the work that you do, will know this far better than me, but a roof over your head is not enough. The question is the mental health support, is the support back into work, all that other support that has to be put around people. And that has to be seen as an investment. And I've been urging the government to make central funds available for it, because I think it's very difficult for local authorities to find the funds for that sort of shelter and that sort of support. I know that many of you are doing it, but I think it's got to be seen as a central government responsibility. And I think that, you know, the idea that in 6 to 9 months we'll see homelessness as we did 6 to 9 months ago would be, you know, a completely unjust and unfair result of this pandemic. Ian, on the new deal, nobody's against building and investment in infrastructure, schools, hospitals, you name it. But my concern about the speech the Prime Minister gave yesterday is that actually not much of it is new. We did an audit of the promises he made yesterday against existing promises or manifesto commitments, and there's a massive overlap. And it's not much of a deal. And my concern is that because of the furlough schemes, which have been very good and which we've supported, and because of the support for the self-employed, which again have been good and we've supported, the Chancellor did the right thing in those schemes. There are gaps in implementation, and there are gaps that some people have fallen through, and that's a massive problem. But basically the schemes have been good. But we've got, I think, half of the entire UK workforce on either furlough or effectively unemployed. And therefore we're facing the prospect over the next 3 to 6 months of unemployment on a scale we haven't seen for a generation. I feel that because of the support schemes, we're collectively, if you like, shielded from this. I don't think people have completely appreciated what is about to happen. But you can see the early evidence. Airbus, EasyJet, making many other manufacturers making, Rolls-Royce, you name it, making announcement about job losses. As we go through the next few weeks and months, and the furlough scheme is wound down, I think there is the real prospects of millions of people becoming unemployed. And that really ought to be the focus. And building over a 5 or 10 year period is not going to help those people. And so I think the focus has to be on jobs.
Sorry, Keir, you've muted yourself. Sorry, Keir, you're still on mute, Keir. I'm not quite sure why. I think it might have been a system override. Can you take yourself off mute?
With the system.
That's better. We can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Nick, the system just went down. Can you hear me again now?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Keir, thanks.
Apologies, that was just a glitch at our end with the laptop I'm using. So anyway, what I'm saying, Ian, and I know you don't want to make a party political point about it, so I'll say that I don't think the New Deal's anywhere near enough. I think the focus has to be on jobs, and my strong view is there should be a July budget. I can't believe that we're going into a period where there could be millions unemployed this autumn, and we're not having a July budget. We need that July budget. If we don't have it in July, we won't be having a budget till probably October or November. We could be deep in the economic crisis by then. I think that I would support infrastructure projects being brought forward. I'm not going to quarrel with building, but we need to do a number of other things. One is the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, needs to be more flexible. It's obvious that some sectors are beginning to go back to open up. Others are just not going to be able to in the time frame available. The furlough scheme ends at the end of October. If you're in hospitality, if you're in retail, if you're in aspects of travel and some service sectors, you're not going to be able to function at the end of October in any meaningful way. And therefore, I think the furlough scheme needs to be more flexible, and we need to provide ongoing support for the sectors that need it. And because otherwise businesses are going to go bust and people are going to lose their job. And these are businesses that are viable businesses, good businesses, that are only going to go bust because of the circumstances they find themselves in with coronavirus. The other thing I would do, and I heard something from the Prime Minister about this today that we need to probe, is to have an equivalent of the Future Jobs Fund that the Labour government put in place in 2009, which is a scheme to ensure that where people do lose their job, there is support and a planned route back into jobs, particularly for young people. So, Ian, a long answer, but I think the focus for me would be on jobs, and how do you protect jobs now? Because I fear that if you lose your job or you lose your firm, it'll be that much more difficult to come back from that. On further sort of structuring of local government, etc., and decision making, the principle I operate to is that decisions about people should be made as near to people as possible. And that's why I support the idea of power leaving Westminster and Whitehall and being much closer through local authorities to people on the ground. But I'd go beyond that, and a lot of people on this call will have been involved in the initiatives. There are very good initiatives by local authorities to put power even closer to their communities, because quite often a local authority seems remote to people, and therefore whether it's a housing development or a community centre or the provision of services, where councils, and there's been a lot of innovation on this, are able to put the decision-making influence back closer to people, then I think that has been a huge success, and we should build on that. And you know, in Camden, we had a project where an old council block was coming down, a new building was going up, and residents were being transferred one to the other. And the council, Camden Council, involved the residents in the planning of the block and the design of the block, the design of the flats they were going to be going into. And when I went to see that shortly after it was opened, the pride in the local residents in what had happened, because they'd been part of it, was huge. And so I'm a big fan of getting power much closer to communities, much closer to people, in local government, but beyond local government. And this goes back to something I said in the speech. It's a huge amount, I think, we can learn politically from what local councils are doing, because there is lots of innovation here that's happened over the last few years, and we need to pick that up, hold it up to the light, and learn from it.
Thanks, questioners. I'll move on to another round of 3 questions. So I'll take Saima Afzal, Liz Clements, and Javeria Hussain. Just while we're getting those up on screen, Keir, when do you think you might be able to do some travelling around the country to come and see all this good practice from local government?
Nick, a good question. I actually did my first visit last Thursday to Stevenage, a great council, and we looked at some of the innovation there. They've got a major rebuild in the town centre there that's going to move the bus station from the middle of one of the main squares to what is now a car park, open up that square, and regeneration of the buildings around it, which is a fantastic project, all about bringing the town centre, the high street back to life, which is something that I think is vitally important. We also saw some of the local traders there that have suffered through the last few weeks and months, and it was really fantastic to be out. It was the first time I've been on a train in 3 months. So Nick, the answer to the question is soon, I hope we can do it. We'll have to do it in a COVID-safe way, but I am now doing visits and look forward to seeing some of you in those visits in the coming weeks.
Great. I know you probably won't be short of invites after today's session. Let's bring the questioners in then. Saima first, please.
Hello, I had 2 questions, and I'm not sure which one you want me to bring in. The one about the trade unions or the one about inclusion?
Trade unions, please, because it's interesting.
Yeah. The reason I asked the question is there's obviously an economic crisis that's hitting us, and jobs are being cut, redundancies are being made, and at the same time we need to have fair pay and safe working environments. So I want to see what role the unions will have. I believe they will have a role, a strong role to play to protect jobs and unnecessary cuts and safe conditions being defied. So I wonder what Sir Keir Starmer sees their role going forward within the Labour Party.
Thanks, Simon. Liz, can I just remind you to just introduce yourselves as well, just so we know where you're from?
Nick, I've just got a bell going off. That's all right, it's finished.
We think, by the way, it's probably Gary Porter, Lord Porter, setting it off deliberately. Lord Porter is due to hold LGA conferences for years to come. Liz, sorry.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Keir, for that inspiring talk. It's really good to have you with us at this conference and to hear your commitment to local government. I'm Liz Clements. I'm a Labour councillor in Bourneville in Birmingham, and I'm also the chair of the Council's Sustainability and Transport Scrutiny Committee. I want to ask you about the climate emergencies that many councils have declared with really ambitious targets for achieving zero carbon. Will you, as Labour leader, commit to maintaining and developing Labour's Green New Deal policies and targets and continue to challenge the government robustly on its policy choices, like its decision to allocate £27 billion to road funding at a time when we need to rise to the climate emergency? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. And Javiria.
So hi, Keir. Javeria Hussain, Labour and Cooperative Party councillor from Luton. I think you indirectly touched on this with regards to the furlough scheme for local businesses. I see myself as a champion for local business, and for me, the recovery of SMEs is going to be vital to any post-COVID recovery for the UK, and especially for local communities and also local economies. What more is Labour planning to do, or what is Labour's strategy for ensuring that the SMEs actually get more support than they're currently being offered by the government? Thank you.
Great, Nick, I'll take those three. On the question of trade unions, they've got a vital role in recovering from coronavirus and actually moving forward on some pretty obvious and basic fronts. The first thing is a safe working environment, particularly with COVID-19. As we ease the lockdown, more people going back to work, services being delivered, etc. It's very important that trade unions are involved in ensuring that there are safe places of work. There's a legal duty on all employers to provide a safe place of work, and that needs to be provided, and trade unions play a huge part in that and in monitoring that, and arguing obviously for fair pay. And every good company, every good organisation works better with trade unions, because obviously when the trade union and the employer are able to negotiate, that leads to better outcomes for everybody. So there's a huge part for trade unions in this going forward, and we should make sure they're fully involved in everything that we do. Liz, on climate change and zero carbon. Firstly, can I just say, well done to all the councils that are working really hard on this, because a lot of the work on carbon emissions and reducing them is done by local councils, whether through the schemes to get cars off the road, whether by restructuring the way roads work, or by using buses. I mean, I drove a bus in Bristol, which was powered by gas from discarded food. There are lots of things that councils are doing to reduce carbon emissions, and it's another example of the sort of initiative that we should be taking notice of. I think that the Green New Deal is vitally important. And we can't afford to make the same mistake as we made, in my view, coming out of the 08-09 crash, where because of the scale of the financial crash, I think the focus was taken off climate change. And there was a lost decade, I think, where climate change didn't have the priority it should have done. We can't make that mistake again. So as we rebuild coming out of this crisis, we've got to ensure that the sort of Green New Deal is hardwired into everything that we do, and that climate change is very much part of a central priority as we go forward. We can't take our eye off that ball again. In relation to businesses, and particularly small and medium-sized businesses, I think that There's a lot central government can do to support. There's a lot local government can do to support businesses. I actually think that giving power to local authorities to make more strategic decisions to support their business communities is very important as we go forward through all of this. And we do need to look at some of the very loud, we need to consider some of the very loud and powerful arguments that small and medium-sized businesses are making to us about the way rates work, and whether that's fair in the economy as it operates now in the 21st century. There's a huge amount of work to do there.
Thanks, Keir. Let me move on to another couple of questioners then. Let me bring, actually, an interesting question here from Kathy Guthrie. So let's have Kathy Guthrie up to ask a question, and also Asher Craig, please.
I can't see anyone anymore, Nick, is one of the problems of the way this technology's gone down here. So I'm hearing, but I'm imagining people, but I can't actually see them, so just bear with me.
At the moment, Keir, we can see and hear you, which is...
Well, that's good. That you've got the advantage on me.
Kathy, are you there yet? Yes, Kathy. Kathy, you might need to unmute, sorry.
Yes, thank you. It was congratulations to Sir Keir for his appointment, but I just felt that with the pandemic in line, I think it would be good if everybody is seen to be working together, and I know you have points to make, and I know the government have made mistakes and so on and so forth, but I think to get it through and to get confidence back for the communities, I think it would be better if we could be all seen to be working together. And just as an aside, I happen to be chair of planning, for which I've got next week, so the planning question earlier was quite interesting. Thank you.
Sorry, Kathy, could you just remind us which party and authority you're from, just so we all know?
Mid Suffolk District Council, and I am a Conservative representative.
And Asher, please.
Oh, hi, sorry. Apologies. Hi, everyone. I'm Councillor Asher Craig. I'm Deputy Mayor of Bristol City Council. We are just about to launch a deliberative democracy approach to underpin the work that we're doing around recovery. So I wanted to know from Sir Keir whether or not this should be something that Council should consider going forward, because I've been very clear from, and I've only been a councillor for 4 years, but it's quite clear that there are so many citizens across the city who have a lot to say but are not engaged in the democratic processes that we actually have in place. And we just feel that deliberative democracy is an approach that we can take to ensure that we're hearing all of the voices of the city, and they are very much a part of the recovery. So wanting to know if this is something that you think that all councils should consider as part of our relationship with the citizens.
Thanks, Asher. And let me also squeeze in one more from Mary Clarkson, because this is also, I think, a really important question that we've not, the topic of which we've not covered yet. So, Mary, if we can get you up on to ask your question as well, please.
Yes, thank you, and congratulations, Sir Keir. It's great to have you as the leader of the Labour Party. I'm from Oxford City Council, where I've got a cabinet responsibility for city centre and tourism. Now, a lot of our businesses are, well, before lockdown were thriving, but obviously we're a relatively small city, which is heavily dependent on our 2 universities and on tourism. Lots of those businesses do have medium and long-term viability, but they do need some sort of bridging finance between now and probably early next year to tide them over. And we're seeing lots of them now that furlough's coming to an end, looking to close down. And it's going to be an absolute tragedy to lose well-established, popular, independent companies just for the sake of money to see them through over the next 6 to 8 months. And I wondered what pressure you could put on central government to support those businesses over that time.
Thank you, Nick. Shall I take those 3?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Kathy, thank you very much for that question, really important question, which is, you know, how do political parties operate during a period of national and international crisis? And what I said when I became leader of the Labour Party was that I would offer constructive opposition in the national interest. And what I meant by that, and I spelled it out, was that the Labour Party under my leadership would have the courage to support the government where we think it's getting it right. And therefore, when we went into lockdown, we took the political decision to support the government in lockdown. And because of that, I felt, as a matter of duty, the Labour Party should very strongly advocate and support the government's guidance throughout lockdown. You know, whether or not we all agreed with every word of it was neither here nor there. If we were going to support lockdown, in my view, we had to support the guidance and the rules under the guidance that the government had set out. And I repeatedly said on the media that people should follow the government's guidance, because I didn't think it was in the national interest for us to nitpick about that. Equally, and you know, more recently, when last week the Prime Minister said from the 4th of July, I openly said that we would support that as a step in the right direction, because I accept that we've got to reopen our economy if we're going to mitigate the economic crisis that could be upon us, and frankly to enable children to get back to school. And therefore, I thought we should have the courage of saying we support the direction of travel, support what the Prime Minister is trying to do on the 4th of July. Now, I've taken a lot of criticism for this, but I thought it was the right thing to do. It doesn't mean that we don't then point out the risks involved, and that's what I've been trying to do. So constructive opposition means supporting the government where it's the right thing to do, but also challenging the government where that is the right thing to do. And what I've tried to do is not challenge the government just to score a party political point, but to challenge the government where I think we can genuinely change things, put things right, or get the government to speed up. And therefore, what I've focused my attention on is things like protective equipment to the front line, because I thought that was an important challenge to make, to force the government to up its game, frankly, because you know, certainly a few weeks ago, the position in relation to protective equipment across a number of fronts was pretty dreadful, particularly in places like care homes, and therefore that was a challenge that we, in a sense, were duty bound to make. Challenge the government on testing, because the testing capacity and the tests actually carried out was at a very low level just a couple of months ago. It's better now. Challenge the government on track, trace and isolate, because we want it to work. I want to challenge the Prime Minister on that test, trace and isolate, not because I want it to fail. I actually want it to work, because it's only if it works that we can open more of our economy, open our schools in the way that we'd all like, etc. So it is a question, Kathy, of trying to get that balance right. Now, people across this call and the public in general will take a view on whether we got the judgment call right or wrong. I do understand that. And we test ourselves the whole time as to whether we got the judgment call right or wrong. But I do think in a national crisis, all political leaders should act in the national interest. And if that means where it's right to do so, supporting the government, then I'm perfectly happy to say so and do so, because I think in the end, the public are really worried about the health crisis we're through, and they're beginning to be really worried about the economic crisis that we're going through, and they don't just want to see politicians squabbling just because we can. So Kathy, thank you for that, and I hope that makes sense in relation to my approach. Asha, on deliberative democracy, you're absolutely right. There's huge numbers of people in our communities who want to be more involved in decision making, have got real contributions to make. And therefore, in whatever form, I'm a big fan of this. Citizens' assemblies, for example, I think are a very good idea. Again, to quote Camden, which is a great council led by Georgia Gould, my local council leader, we had a citizens' assembly to look at ways to reduce carbon and to have greener ways of doing our transport in Camden. And it was a very intense session where members of the public gave up quite a lot of time in the assembly to come up with ideas about how we could do it. So I think there's a great deal in it, and I think we will, in the long run, break down the distrust in politics and politicians only if we involve people more in the decisions we're making, so people feel part of it, that they've influenced it. And of course there are great ideas there that people have. So I'm a supporter of that. Mary, in relation to Oxford, in a nutshell, you have summed up one of my major concerns about what happens next in the economic crisis, because in Oxford and in many towns and cities, villages and areas across England and Wales, there are perfectly viable companies that have been well run, that are doing well, perfectly viable, but just can't cope with the restrictions of COVID-19. And tourism is a classic example of that. Tourist businesses risk going under, not because they're bad businesses, but because if tourism's dried up because people can't travel, you can't run your business. And so what I've been trying to do is put pressure on the government to say, where it makes sense, extend the support, extend the furlough, or call it what you like, but don't let businesses go under in October, November, if they could be perfectly viable and still up and running in the early part of next year, if they just had that bit of support. Now, I do know this is expensive. The government's put a huge amount into furlough and in supporting self-employed, billions of pounds. I do know it's very expensive, but I think that, frankly, there's not much point in a furlough scheme that just delays the cliff edge for some of these companies. It's better to see a bit more support for a bit longer where it's absolutely needed as an investment for the future, because if the tourist industry, tourist businesses go under, then getting back up the cliff is going to be that much harder. So, Mary, in a way, your examples of Oxford are very good examples of why it is we're calling on the Chancellor to extend those furlough schemes and not have a one-size-fits-all with a cliff edge at the end of October. Thank you, Nick.
Keir, we don't have any time for any more panel questions, but let me ask you this very final question from me. You've clearly embedded yourself already in the role of Leader of the Opposition. You've got a huge grasp across such a range of policy areas. What on earth do you do to switch off at the end of the day and leave it all behind?
Oh, well, Nick, I happily have 2 children. Our little boy was 12 yesterday and our little girl is 10. They have no regard for what I do for a living. They have no regard for the fact that I'm Leader of the Opposition. And therefore, as soon as I get home, I get the usual demands and more from them of everything they need, 100%. So that is fantastic. And it's good to be sort of brought down to the ground immediately I walk through the front door. And just to end with a vignette, this is our little girl who's 9 going on 10. She said to me the other day, "You've been at Parliament, Daddy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "More blah, blah, blah." And so that is her sense of what I do for a living. And so that's a great leveller. So I'm allowed to stop being Leader of the Opposition and just be Dad when I get home, which is probably a very good thing.
Keir, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been an absolutely fantastic session. I know that everybody's found it really useful, really valuable. I think it's probably been the highest attended session so far of our virtual conference. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to working with you even more closely in the future. If we were here in person, we'll be able to give you a big round of applause. If you just have to accept that we're all mentally applauding you and wishing you all the very best. Keir.
Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for inviting me and everything you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Keir. Thanks, everybody.